Welcome to Sleepless History, where we explore the past in soothing detail to help you drift off to sleep. Tonight, we journey back to the early 1800s to follow two men and their crew as they traverse the unknown American West. This is the story of the Lewis and Clark expedition, a tale of exploration, discovery, and endurance that would shape the future of a young nation. Get comfortable and let us transport you to a time when vast portions of North America remained unmapped, when indigenous peoples held the knowledge of lands that Europeans had barely glimpsed, and when the promise of discovery drew brave souls into the wilderness. If you enjoy tonight's story, please don't forget to like the video and subscribe. It helps the channel more than you may think. Part 1. The Beginnings. Our story begins not with the expedition itself, but with the vision of a president. Thomas Jefferson, the third president of the United States, had long harbored dreams of Western exploration. Even before he assumed office in 1801, Jefferson possessed an insatiable curiosity about what lay beyond the Mississippi River. The Western Territories represented not just land, but possibility itself, a vast canvas upon which the young republic might paint its future. Jefferson's fascination with the West was both practical and philosophical. As a man of the Enlightenment, he believed in the power of knowledge and scientific inquiry. He imagined that the Western lands might hold undiscovered plant and animal species, mineral wealth, and perhaps even living mastodons, those great prehistoric creatures whose bones had been unearthed in various parts of North America. Jefferson collected fossils and Native American artifacts, studied maps, and read every account of Western travel he could obtain. But Jefferson's interest was not purely academic. He understood that whoever controlled the Western Territories would shape the destiny of North America. The British maintained a presence in Canada to the north. The Spanish claimed vast territories to the south and west. France, under Napoleon Bonaparte, had recently reacquired the Louisiana Territory from Spain through a secret treaty signed in 1800 known as the Treaty of San Ildefonso. This massive territory, stretching from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains and from the Gulf of Mexico to the Canadian border, represented a strategic prize of immense value. American settlers and traders were already pushing westward, floating down the Ohio River, establishing farms and trading posts in Kentucky and Tennessee. The Mississippi River served as the crucial artery for commerce, allowing Western farmers to ship their goods downriver to New Orleans and from there to markets on the East Coast and beyond. Control of New Orleans and the Mississippi meant control of Western commerce. When Spain revoked American trading rights in New Orleans in 1798, it had nearly led to war. Now, with France holding the territory, Jefferson faced an even more formidable power on America's western border. Jefferson moved quickly. In January of 1803, he sent a secret message to Congress requesting $2,500 for an expedition to explore the Missouri River and find a water route to the Pacific Ocean. He framed the expedition primarily as a commercial venture, seeking to expand American trade with Native American tribes and to find that long-sought prize, the Northwest Passage, an all-water route across the continent. Congress approved the funding. Even as Jefferson planned the expedition, dramatic events unfolded in Europe and the Caribbean. Napoleon Bonaparte's dreams of a renewed French Empire in the Americas crumbled as a slave rebellion in Haiti, led by Toussaint Louverture, destroyed French forces sent to suppress it. Without Haiti as a base, Louisiana became a strategic liability for France. Napoleon needed money for his wars in Europe. In April of 1803, French Foreign Minister Charles Maurice de Talleyrand shocked American negotiators James Monroe and Robert Livingston by offering to sell not just New Orleans, but the entire Louisiana territory. The Americans could scarcely believe their fortune. After swift negotiations, they agreed to purchase the territory for $15 million, approximately 4 cents per acre. The Louisiana Purchase, finalized on April 30th, 1803, doubled the size of the United States overnight. The nation now stretched from the Atlantic Ocean to the Rocky Mountains, encompassing some 828,000 square miles of largely unexplored territory. The Louisiana Purchase transformed Jefferson's planned expedition from a covert reconnaissance mission through foreign territory into a grand exploration of America's own new lands. The expedition would map these territories, establish American presence, assess resources, document native peoples, and search for a practical route to the Pacific. But who would lead such an expedition? Jefferson needed someone with wilderness experience, scientific knowledge, leadership ability, and unwavering loyalty. He found all these qualities in his personal secretary, Captain Meriwether Lewis. Meriwether Lewis was born on August 18, 1774, in Albemarle County, Virginia, not far from Jefferson's Monticello estate. The Lewis family had deep Virginia roots. Meriwether's father, William Lewis, died when the boy was only 5 years old, possibly from pneumonia contracted after falling into a cold river. His mother, Lucy Meriwether Lewis, remarried, and young Meriwether spent several years in Georgia on his stepfather's plantation before returning to Virginia to manage the family estate at age 13. Life on the Virginia frontier shaped Lewis's character. He learned to hunt, track, and survive in the wilderness. Neighbors recalled stories of young Meriwether going hunting in the middle of winter nights, undeterred by cold or darkness. This self-reliant, determined streak would define his life. In 1794, Lewis joined the Virginia militia to help suppress the Whiskey Rebellion, a protest against federal taxation of whiskey in western Pennsylvania. This brief service led to a commission in the regular army. Lewis served in the infantry, gradually rising through the ranks. In 1795, he joined the elite rifle company commanded by William Clark, beginning a friendship that would shape American history. William Clark was born on August 1st, 1770, in Caroline County, Virginia, the 9th of 10 children born to John and Anne Rogers Clark. The Clark family was well established in Virginia society. William's older brother, George Rogers Clark, earned fame as a Revolutionary War hero, leading successful campaigns against British forces in the Illinois country and earning the nickname Conqueror of the Old Northwest. In 1785, the Clark family moved to Kentucky, then the western frontier. Young William grew up in this rough country, learning the skills that would serve him throughout his life: surveying, map-making, woodcraft, and dealing with Native Americans. Unlike Lewis, who was introspective and moody, Clark possessed a steady, practical temperament. Where Lewis had scientific curiosity, Clark had mechanical ingenuity and organizational talent. Clark joined the militia in 1789 and saw action in numerous battles against Native American tribes resisting white settlement in the Ohio River Valley. He served under General Anthony Wayne in the campaigns that led to the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794 and the subsequent Treaty of Greenville in 1795. These experiences gave Clark extensive knowledge of frontier warfare and diplomacy. Lewis and Clark served together only briefly in the army before their paths diverged. Clark resigned his commission in July of 1796 to manage his family's affairs. Lewis continued his military career, serving at various frontier posts. Despite their different paths, the two men maintained mutual respect and friendship. In 1801, when Thomas Jefferson became president, he invited Meriwether Lewis to serve as his personal secretary. Jefferson knew the Lewis family and recognized in young Meriwether the qualities he valued: intelligence, reliability, and courage. For 2 years, Lewis lived in the White House, handling Jefferson's correspondence, managing his schedule, and absorbing the president's vast knowledge. During this time, Jefferson prepared Lewis for the Western expedition he had long planned. The president arranged for Lewis to study in Philadelphia with leading scientists of the day. Lewis learned celestial navigation from Robert Patterson, mathematics professor at the University of Pennsylvania. He studied botany with Benjamin Smith Barton, zoology and anatomy with Caspar Wistar, and medicine with Benjamin Rush, perhaps America's most famous physician. Dr. Rush provided Lewis with a detailed list of medical supplies and taught him basic medical procedures. Rush also gave Lewis a set of instructions for maintaining health in the wilderness, along with his famous bilious pills, powerful laxatives containing calomel, a mercury compound. These pills, sometimes called Rush's Thunderbolts, would become a staple of the expedition's medical kit, used to treat a remarkable variety of ailments. Lewis also met with Andrew Ellicott, who had surveyed the boundary between the United States and Spanish territories, and with various fur traders who had travelled up the Missouri River. He studied maps, collected specimens of surveying instruments, and compiled lists of supplies. Jefferson wanted the expedition to make scientific observations, so Lewis learned to use a sextant and chronometer for determining latitude and longitude, to measure temperature and barometric pressure, and to preserve plant and animal specimens. By June of 1803, Lewis was ready. He wrote to William Clark, inviting his old friend to co-command the expedition. Lewis's letter, dated June 19, 1803, was remarkable for its generous offer. Though Lewis held a captain's commission and Clark had resigned as a lieutenant, Lewis proposed equal command. He wrote that Clark would be appointed a captain in the Corps of Engineers and would share its dangers, its honours, and its rewards equally. Clark accepted immediately. He wrote back on July 18th, 1803, "My friend, I do assure you that no man lives with whom I would prefer to undertake such a trip as yourself." This decision to share command equally, though unusual in military hierarchy, proved crucial to the expedition's success. Lewis and Clark's complementary skills and unshakable partnership would see them through challenges that would have broken lesser men. However, the War Department bureaucracy failed to deliver on Lewis's promise of a captain's commission for Clark. Despite Lewis's repeated requests, Clark received only a lieutenant's commission. The two men agreed to hide this fact from the expedition members, who would address both leaders as captain. This deception held throughout the journey, and the men of the expedition never knew that their two commanders held different ranks. Part 2. Preparations and the journey begins. Lewis spent the summer and fall of 1803 preparing for the expedition. He travelled to Harper's Ferry, Virginia, where the Federal Armory was located, to oversee the construction of a collapsible iron frame boat of his own design. This boat, which Lewis called the Experiment, was intended for use on the upper Missouri River, where large trees for building wooden boats might be scarce. Workers at Harper's Ferry crafted the iron frame in sections that could be disassembled and transported overland, then reassembled and covered with animal skins, to create a 36-foot boat capable of carrying several tons of cargo. Lewis also supervised the assembly of the expedition's armament. The men would carry Model 1796 rifles, the latest military firearms. Lewis purchased 15 of these muzzle-loading flintlock rifles, each capable of accurate fire at over 200 yards. He also obtained air rifles, an advanced weapon that used compressed air to fire a ball without the smoke, noise, or delay of reloading that plagued conventional firearms. The air rifle would prove invaluable for impressing Native American tribes and for hunting without alerting game or enemies. The expedition's supply list was extensive and carefully considered. Lewis purchased brass and tin kettles for cooking, mosquito netting, oilcloth tarpaulins, 12 pounds of soap, 193 pounds of portable soup made from boiled down meat stock, and nearly 200 pounds of fishing hooks and line. Medical supplies included 50 dozen Rush's pills, laudanum, opium, wine, and various surgical instruments. For trading with Native Americans, Lewis assembled an enormous inventory of goods: 130 rolls of tobacco, 12 dozen pocket mirrors, 4,000 needles, 500 brooches, 72 tobacco boxes, 140 brass thimbles, beads of every colour and size, knives, tomahawks, and yards of bright cloth. These trade goods were not mere trinkets, but valuable commodities in Native American trading networks. A single brass kettle might be worth several beaver pelts. A handful of blue beads could purchase a horse. Lewis also packed gifts specifically for tribal chiefs: formal military coats with brass buttons, cocked hats with feathers, American flags, and Jefferson Peace Medals. These medals, struck in various sizes, bore Jefferson's profile on one side and clasped hands with a crossed tomahawk and peace pipe on the other, along with the words "peace" and "friendship." The expedition carried dozens of these medals, to be presented in formal ceremonies that would establish diplomatic relations between the United States and Western tribes. Scientific instruments rounded out the cargo: sextants, an artificial horizon, a chronometer, compasses, a telescope, a microscope, thermometers, a surveyor's compass, and equipment for preserving plant and animal specimens. Lewis packed writing paper, ink, and blank journals for recording observations. The total cost of supplies approached $2,500, though Lewis exceeded his budget by purchasing additional items he deemed necessary. In the fall of 1803, Lewis departed Pittsburgh with a 55-foot keelboat he had commissioned. This vessel, pointed at both ends and equipped with oars, poles, and a square sail, would serve as the expedition's primary transport on the Missouri River. The keelboat could carry approximately 10 tons of cargo and was manned by 22 oars plus the steersman. Lewis and a small crew floated down the Ohio River, recruiting men and gathering additional supplies at various stops. The Ohio River was low that fall, and the journey proved frustratingly slow as the boat repeatedly ran aground on sandbars. Lewis's journals from this period reveal his impatience and mounting frustration with delays. On October 14th, 1803, Lewis reached Clarksville in the Indiana Territory, where William Clark awaited with several recruits he had enlisted from Kentucky. The two captains spent several days selecting men and organizing supplies before continuing down the Ohio to the Mississippi River. The expedition reached the confluence of the Ohio and Mississippi rivers in mid-November. They turned upstream, fighting the Mississippi's powerful current, and arrived at Camp Dubois, across from the mouth of the Missouri River near St. Louis, in mid-December. Camp Dubois, also called Camp River Dubois, would serve as the expedition's winter quarters and training ground. The site was in American territory on the east bank of the Mississippi, just across from Spanish-controlled St. Louis. This location allowed the captains to gather intelligence about the Missouri River and the peoples who lived along it, while drilling their men in the discipline and skills they would need. The Corps of Discovery, as the expedition would be known, was taking shape. Lewis and Clark had recruited carefully, seeking men with useful skills, hunters, blacksmiths, carpenters, and boatmen. Most were young, in their 20s, and many had military experience. The captains prioritized single men without family obligations, reasoning that such men would more readily accept the risks and hardships ahead. Among the recruits were brothers Reuben and Joseph Field, expert hunters and woodsmen from Kentucky. John Coulter, a skilled hunter and tracker, would later return to the West and become one of the first mountain men. George Drouillard, pronounced Drouillard, signed on as an interpreter and hunter. The son of a French-Canadian father and a Shawnee mother, Drouillard possessed wilderness skills that would prove invaluable. He was fluent in French and several Native American languages, an expert hunter and skilled in sign language, the lingua franca of the Great Plains. Patrick Gass, a carpenter and veteran soldier, joined the group. His construction skills would be essential for building winter quarters and repairing equipment. Gass was older than most of the men, 33 years old, and his maturity and experience would earn him promotion to sergeant during the journey. John Ordway, a New Hampshire native who had served in the army, became one of the expedition's sergeants. Methodical and literate, Ordway would keep one of the most complete journals of the journey. Charles Floyd, son of a Revolutionary War veteran, was another sergeant. Young and enthusiastic, Floyd would tragically become the expedition's only fatality. Nathaniel Pryor, a cousin of Charles Floyd, served as the third sergeant. York, William Clark's enslaved servant, also joined the expedition. A large, strong man, approximately Clark's age, York had been Clark's companion since childhood. York's presence on the expedition was involuntary, but he would prove his worth many times over and would be granted certain freedoms during the journey that he did not enjoy in normal life. The captains also recruited French-Canadian boatmen to help navigate the Missouri River. These engagés, as they were called, were experienced voyageurs who had worked the river trade for years. They signed on only for the first year, agreeing to help the expedition reach the Mandan villages in present-day North Dakota, then return to St. Louis with reports, specimens, and maps. Through the winter of 1803 and 1804, the men at Camp du Bois trained and prepared. The captains drilled them in military discipline, teaching them to follow orders instantly and without question. They practiced with their weapons, held shooting competitions, and learned to work together as a unit. Clark worked on maps, incorporating information gathered from traders and travelers. Lewis studied and refined his plans. Life at Camp du Bois was not always harmonious. The men were young, rowdy, and often drunk when they could obtain whiskey. The captain's journals record numerous disciplinary incidents, men returning late from leave, fighting among themselves, or disobeying orders. Lewis and Clark responded with military justice, holding courts martial and imposing punishments ranging from extra guard duty to lashes with a whip. The captains understood that establishing discipline now might save lives later when the expedition faced genuine dangers. Winter gave way to spring. The ice on the Mississippi broke up, and the Missouri River, swollen with snowmelt from distant mountains, ran high and brown with silt. By May of 1804, preparations were complete. The keelboat was loaded with supplies. 2 smaller boats, called pirogues, would accompany the keelboat. One, painted white, carried 6 oars. The other, painted red, carried 7 oars. On May 14th, 1804, the Corps of Discovery departed Camp du Bois. The expedition consisted of approximately 45 men, divided into 3 groups. The permanent party, which would attempt to reach the Pacific Ocean, included the 2 captains, 3 sergeants, and 23 enlisted men, along with Clark's slave York and Drouillard the interpreter. A larger group of soldiers and boatmen would accompany the expedition only to the Mandan villages, then return to St. Louis. Additional French boatmen, hired temporarily, would help navigate the lower Missouri. The flotilla crossed the Mississippi and entered the Missouri River. They fired a swivel gun in salute, the sharp crack echoing off the water. The men bent to their oars, and the boats began moving upstream against the powerful current. The journey had begun. Part 3. Up the Missouri. The Missouri River in 1804 was nothing like the channelized, dam-controlled waterway of today. It was a wild, unpredictable river, constantly changing course, tearing away banks, creating new channels, and depositing massive quantities of silt that turned its water the colour of coffee with cream. Pierre-Antoine Tabot, a French trader, had called it the River of Floating Earth, an apt description of a river that could rise 20 feet in a day and whose waters carried entire trees, drowned buffalo, and chunks of crumbling riverbank. Travelling up the Missouri was exhausting work. When the wind was favourable, the men could raise the keelboat's square sail. More often, they relied on oars, poles, or the cordel, a rope attached to the mast. When using the cordel, men would go ashore, attach the rope to their shoulders, and tow the boat upstream like draft animals, stumbling through mud, brush, and over rocks. Sometimes the banks were too steep or covered with dense growth, forcing the men to remain in the boats, poling against the bottom or rowing with all their strength just to make a few miles progress. The expedition averaged 10 to 15 miles per day during the first weeks. though some days they managed 20 miles, and on bad days they made only a few miles despite backbreaking effort. The captains took turns commanding the boats while the other walked along the shore, hunting, exploring, and making observations. They measured distances using a log line and recorded the river's course in detailed journals. Lewis collected plant specimens, pressing them between sheets of paper, and made notes on geology, soil types, and minerals. Wildlife abounded. Deer grazed in meadows along the shore. Turkeys roosted in the trees. Geese and ducks covered the water in vast flocks. The men saw their first prairie dogs, small burrowing rodents that barked like dogs and lived in enormous communal towns that stretched for miles. Lewis attempted to capture one by pouring water down its burrow, hoping to flush it out. After pouring in several barrels of water without success, he finally obtained a specimen by digging. Lewis carefully packed the live prairie dog for shipment back to President Jefferson, along with preserved specimens and detailed written descriptions. The expedition passed the settlements of Saint Charles and La Charrette, the last outposts of European civilization. Beyond La Charrette, they entered country inhabited primarily by Native Americans. The captains were eager to meet the indigenous peoples and establish friendly relations. Jefferson had instructed them to inform all tribes that the United States was now their father, that Spanish and French traders were gone, and that American traders would soon come to exchange goods fairly. This message was complicated by the fact that in 1804, Spain still officially controlled much of the territory west of the Mississippi. The Louisiana Purchase transfer of power would not be complete until ceremonies in St. Louis in March of 1804, and Spanish officials in the southwest disputed the boundaries of the purchase. Moreover, the Native American tribes had their own perspectives on these matters. They had traded with French and Spanish merchants for generations and had no particular desire for new fathers or different trading partners. On July 4th, 1804, the expedition celebrated Independence Day at the mouth of the Kansas River near present-day Kansas City. The men fired their rifles in salute. An extra ration of whiskey was distributed, and the day was spent in rest and celebration. Clark named a nearby creek Independence Creek in honor of the day. The expedition had traveled approximately 400 miles up the Missouri and was entering the Great Plains. The landscape was changing. The wooded hills and river bottoms of Missouri gave way to more open country. Vast prairies stretched to the horizon, covered in tall grass that could hide a man on horseback. Buffalo appeared, first in small groups, then in enormous herds that darkened the plains. The hunters killed their first buffalo in early August, and the men feasted on fresh meat. Buffalo was surprisingly good eating, particularly the fatty hump and the tongue, which became expedition favorites. But with the buffalo came mosquitoes and other pests. Clouds of mosquitoes tormented the men constantly during summer. They bit through clothing, covered every exposed bit of skin, and made sleep nearly impossible. Lewis described them as excessively troublesome and noted that the men burned fires and huddled in the smoke to escape them. Gnats swarmed in equally tormenting clouds. Ticks embedded themselves in the men's flesh. And once the expedition encountered a massive cloud of flies so thick that they could barely see and breathe. In early August, the expedition held its first formal council with Native Americans. A small group of Oto and Missouri Indians met the captains at a place they named Council Bluff, near present-day Fort Calhoun, Nebraska. This site was not the same as modern Council Bluffs, Iowa, which lies about 20 miles to the south. The council followed a pattern that would be repeated many times during the expedition. The captains arranged the men in formal military display, with rifles at the ready and the American flag prominently displayed. The Indian leaders sat facing them, and the council began with speeches translated through interpreters. Lewis delivered Jefferson's message. The Spanish and French fathers had gone, and the Americans were now the Indians' new fathers. The great father in Washington desired peace and wished to establish trade. The Indians must cease warring among themselves and must not trade with the British. After the speeches, the captains distributed gifts: Jefferson Peace Medals, American flags, military coats, and various trade goods. The Indians responded with their own speeches, generally expressing friendship but showing limited enthusiasm for abandoning their traditional trading relationships. They particularly questioned why they should stop trading with the British, who had provided good merchandise at fair prices for years. The meeting was cordial, but revealed the challenges ahead. The captains had no real authority to enforce their pronouncements. The United States had no military presence in the region. British traders from Canada continued to operate throughout the northern plains, and the Native American tribes had their own political structures, alliances, and conflicts that had existed for generations. A few speeches and medals would not fundamentally alter these complex relationships. The expedition continued upstream. On August 20th, 1804, Sergeant Charles Floyd fell ill. His symptoms suggested appendicitis, though the captains could not have known this. Appendicitis was not well understood in 1804, and even if the captains had recognized the condition, nothing could have been done. Surgery was not an option in the wilderness, and even in the best hospitals of the day, an appendectomy would have been almost certainly fatal. Floyd's condition deteriorated rapidly. He experienced severe pain in his abdomen and could keep nothing down. The captains tried every remedy they knew: bleeding, purging with Rush's pills, and administering laudanum. Nothing helped. On August 20th, Floyd knew he was dying. He told Clark, "I am going away. I want you to write me a letter." Clark sat with him as Floyd dictated a final message to his family. Charles Floyd died at approximately noon on August 20th, 1804. He was 22 years old. The men buried him on a bluff overlooking the river near present-day Sioux City, Iowa. They erected a cedar post over his grave with his name and date of death. The expedition fired 3 rifle volleys over the grave in military salute. Clark named the nearby stream Floyd's River in his honor. Charles Floyd was the only member of the expedition to die during the entire journey, a remarkable fact given the hazards they would face. After Floyd's death, the men elected Patrick Gass to replace him as sergeant. This was a democratic process unusual in the military, but Lewis and Clark understood that morale was important and that the men would respect a leader they had chosen themselves. Late August brought the expedition into the territory of the Sioux Nation, one of the most powerful tribal confederacies on the Great Plains. The Sioux, or Lakota as they called themselves, controlled much of the northern plains and were formidable warriors and skilled buffalo hunters. They had obtained horses and guns through trade, and had used these advantages to dominate their neighbours. The expedition's first significant encounter with the Sioux occurred in late September near the mouth of the Bad River in present-day South Dakota. A band of Brule Lakota met the expedition. The council began well enough, following the usual pattern of speeches and gifts, but tensions quickly rose. The Lakota chiefs were unimpressed with the gifts offered. They considered the presents inadequate for chiefs of their importance. Moreover, they demanded payment for passage through their territory. The Missouri River was their river. They controlled trade on it, and any party wishing to pass must pay tribute. When Lewis and Clark refused, insisting that they were representatives of the United States government and would pay no tribute, the situation became tense. Warriors surrounded the boats. Several Lakota seized the mooring rope of one of the pirogues. One warrior, who had been drinking whiskey provided earlier by the captains, grabbed Clark as he stood on the shore. Warriors drew bows and fitted arrows. The expedition men readied their weapons. For a few moments, violence seemed inevitable. Clark drew his sword and signaled to Lewis, who was on the keelboat. Lewis ordered his men to prepare the swivel gun, a small cannon mounted on the boat's bow, and to aim it at the Lakota. He called out that they meant no harm but would defend themselves if attacked. The expedition men primed their rifles and took positions along the gunwales. The standoff continued for several long minutes. Then Black Buffalo, one of the chiefs, intervened. He ordered his warriors to release the rope and step back. The crisis passed. Black Buffalo came aboard the keelboat, and the captains agreed to spend a few days with the Lakota, sharing meals and observing dances, but the encounter had been sobering. The captains realized they were traveling through territory where they had no real power, where Native American tribes were powerful and independent, and where their survival depended on diplomacy, luck, and the deterrent effect of their superior firearms. The expedition continued upriver, making slower progress as fall approached, and the days grew shorter. They passed through country inhabited by the Arikara, who lived in fortified earth lodge villages and practiced agriculture alongside buffalo hunting. The Arikara received the expedition cordially, and the captains spent several days with them, conducting councils and gathering information about the river ahead. As October progressed, the expedition raced against approaching winter. The captains needed to find a place to establish winter quarters before the river froze. They pushed on, making as much distance as possible each day. On October 24th, 1804, the expedition reached the villages of the Mandan and Hidatsa peoples near present-day Washburn, North Dakota. These villages were major trading centers where indigenous peoples from across the plains gathered to exchange goods. The Mandans and Hidatsas lived in large earth lodges, substantial structures made of logs and earth that could house multiple families. They raised corn, beans, squash, and sunflowers along the river bottoms, and they hunted buffalo on the surrounding plains. The Mandans received the expedition warmly. They had long experience with European traders and welcomed the possibility of establishing direct trade with Americans. The captains negotiated permission to build a winter fort nearby, and the men immediately began cutting timber and constructing a triangular stockade. Fort Mandan, as they named it, consisted of 2 rows of log huts arranged in a V shape, with a triangular plaza in the center and a high fence connecting the ends of the V. The huts had rooms for the men, storage for supplies, and a room for the captains. The entire fort was designed for defense, with high walls and good sightlines, though relations with the Mandans remained friendly throughout the winter. Construction took until late November. The winter of 1804 to 1805 proved bitterly cold. Temperatures dropped to 40 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. The Missouri River froze solid, with ice thick enough to support loaded wagons. Snow covered the ground. Despite the cold, the expedition remained relatively comfortable in their snug fort. The men spent the winter resting, hunting, trading with the Mandans and Hidatsas, gathering information about the route ahead, and maintaining their equipment. The blacksmiths, Shields and Willard, set up a forge and traded iron tools and weapons for corn and other supplies. Lewis and Clark interviewed traders and Indians about the country to the west, adding details to their maps and trying to plan the best route to the Pacific. It was at Fort Mandan that the expedition recruited 2 people who would prove invaluable: Toussaint Charbonneau and his young Shoshone wife, Sacagawea. Charbonneau was a French-Canadian trader who lived among the Hidatsas. He spoke French and Hidatsa and offered his services as an interpreter. More importantly, he had 2 Shoshone wives, including Sacagawea, who had been captured as a child from the Shoshone people who lived in the Rocky Mountains. The captains realized that Sacagawea could serve as interpreter when they reached Shoshone country, and more importantly, that the presence of a woman and child would signal to tribes they encountered that the expedition's intentions were peaceful. War parties did not travel with women and children. Sacagawea was approximately 16 or 17 years old. She was pregnant when the expedition reached Fort Mandan and would give birth during the winter. Her Shoshone name, often spelled Sacagawea or Sacagawea, has been translated various ways, but most scholars now prefer Sacagawea, meaning bird woman in the Hidatsa language. On February 11th, 1805, Sacagawea went into labor. The birth was long and difficult. Lewis, who attended the birth, tried various remedies to hasten delivery. Finally, on the advice of a French trader, he administered a small portion of a rattlesnake's rattle, crushed and mixed with water. Whether this folk remedy had any actual effect is dubious, but shortly afterward, Sacagawea delivered a healthy baby boy. Charbonneau named him Jean-Baptiste, though Clark would nickname him Pomp or Pompey. Through the winter, the captains compiled reports and specimens to send back to President Jefferson. They had collected numerous plant specimens, animal skins and skeletons, minerals, and artifacts from various tribes. They wrote detailed descriptions of the peoples they had met, the geography they had traversed, and the wildlife they had observed. They also prepared maps showing the Missouri River and the lands adjacent to it, incorporating information from their own observations and from Indian sources. As winter ended and spring approached, the captains made preparations to continue the journey. The large keelboat would return to St. Louis with the specimens, reports, and maps, along with most of the French boatmen and some of the soldiers. The permanent party, now numbering 33 people, including Sacagawea and her infant, would continue in the 2 pirogues and 6 new dugout canoes the men had constructed over the winter. On April 7th, 1805, the keelboat departed downstream, carrying 16 men and the expedition's accumulated treasures. Among the items sent to Jefferson were live animals: 4 magpies, a prairie sharp, tailed grouse, and a prairie dog that had miraculously survived the winter. Most of these creatures would complete the journey successfully, becoming the first representatives of their species seen in the eastern United States. That same day, the permanent party headed upstream into the unknown. Part 4. Into the Unknown. The expedition that departed Fort Mandan on April 7th, 1805, was entering country that no American had seen and that few Europeans had visited. Beyond the Mandan villages, the captains had only vague information from Indian sources and the accounts of a few traders who had ventured short distances upriver. The maps they carried showed the Rocky Mountains as a single ridge, not the multiple ranges that actually existed. Many believed that a short portage from the Missouri's headwaters would lead to rivers flowing to the Pacific. The reality would prove far more challenging. The party now consisted of 33 people, the 2 captains, 26 soldiers and frontiersmen, Drouillard the interpreter, Charbonneau and Sacagawea, York, and baby Jean-Baptiste. They travelled in 6 dugout canoes and the 2 pirogues. Their supplies had been carefully selected for the long journey ahead. They carried no more whiskey, which had run out over the winter, but they had ample ammunition, gunpowder, trade goods, and the portable soup Lewis had purchased in Philadelphia. Progress was good during the early weeks. The spring weather was pleasant, game was abundant, and the river was high with snowmelt. The expedition covered 20 to 30 miles on good days. They passed the mouth of the Yellowstone River on April 26th, a major confluence that the Hidatsas had told them about. Clark noted that the Yellowstone appeared to be a substantial river that might offer an alternative route into the Rockies. The landscape was becoming more arid. The expedition was entering the high plains, where rainfall was scarce and vegetation consisted primarily of short grasses. Buffalo were everywhere, sometimes in herds so vast that their trampling sounded like distant thunder. The hunters killed buffalo regularly, taking only the best cuts and leaving the rest for wolves and grizzly bears. Grizzly bears were a new and dangerous encounter. The expedition had heard about these great bears from the Indians, who described them as powerful, aggressive, and difficult to kill. Lewis initially dismissed these accounts, confident that the expedition's superior firearms would make short work of any bear. He was wrong. The first grizzly bear they encountered in late April took 10 shots before it died. The bear, even mortally wounded, charged the hunters repeatedly and only stopped when it collapsed from blood loss. Lewis revised his opinion of grizzlies immediately. He wrote that these bears were extremely hard to kill and that the Indians may well fear this animal. Over the following weeks, the expedition had numerous encounters with grizzlies, and several men narrowly escaped with their lives after close calls with wounded bears. In one incident, a grizzly chased several men who had wounded it. The men ran for their lives, with some throwing away their rifles in panic. Several jumped into the river to escape. The bear followed them into the water, swimming after them. Finally, the men on shore who had kept their heads and reloaded their rifles shot the bear repeatedly until it died. The captains imposed stricter rules. No one would hunt grizzly bears alone, and hunters would always maintain loaded backup weapons. On June 2nd, 1805, the expedition reached a major fork in the river. One branch came from the northwest, the other from the southwest. This was an unexpected development. The Indian maps had not mentioned such a fork, and the captains were unsure which branch was the true Missouri. The northern fork appeared larger, and its water was muddy, like the Missouri they had been following. The southern fork was clearer and seemed somewhat smaller. The captains faced a critical decision. Choosing the wrong fork could waste weeks or months of travel and might leave them stranded in the mountains when winter came. Most of the men believed the northern fork was the Missouri, as its muddy water matched what they had grown accustomed to. But Lewis and Clark, after studying the river carefully and considering all available information, concluded that the southern fork was the true Missouri. They reasoned that the muddy northern fork drained the plains, while the clear southern fork must come from the mountains. To confirm their decision, Lewis decided to scout ahead on foot with a small party. On June 11th, Lewis and 4 men set out cross-country, following the southern fork. After several days of hiking, Lewis heard a distant roar. On June 13th, he rounded a hill and saw a sight that confirmed their choice, a magnificent waterfall cascading over rocks in a cloud of spray. This was the Great Falls of the Missouri, which the Mandans had described. The southern fork was indeed the Missouri. But the discovery of the Great Falls brought disappointing news. Lewis explored further and found not one waterfall, but a series of 5 major falls and several rapids, stretching nearly 12 miles. The Mandans had mentioned of falls that could be portaged in half a day. This obstacle would take far longer to bypass. Lewis returned to the main party with his news. The men had to portage around all 5 falls, carrying the canoes, pirogues, and supplies overland. They cached the white pirogue, burying it along with some supplies they would not need until the return journey. Then they began the portage. The portage around the Great Falls took nearly a month, from June 21st to July 15th, 1805. It was perhaps the most difficult stretch of the entire expedition. The men constructed crude wagons from cottonwood trees, with wheels cut from logs. They loaded these wagons with supplies and equipment, hitched themselves to the wagons like draft animals, and hauled them across nearly 18 miles of rough terrain. The prairie was dotted with prickly pear cactus. The spines penetrated moccasins and embedded in the men's feet. Each evening, they spent time pulling cactus spines from their bloody, swollen feet. The weather alternated between blazing heat and violent thunderstorms. Hailstones the size of apples pelted the men. Wind threatened to overturn the wagons. Buffalo herds forced them to make detours. At one point, a flash flood nearly killed Clark, Sacagawea, Charbonneau, and baby Jean-Baptiste. They had taken shelter in a ravine during a storm when a wall of water came roaring down the gully. Clark grabbed Sacagawea and pushed her up the steep bank, shoving the baby ahead of her. Charbonneau, paralyzed with fear, had to be physically pulled to safety. They escaped just as a 20-foot wall of water swept through the ravine, carrying trees, rocks, and debris. Meanwhile, Lewis's iron frame boat, the Experiment, proved a complete failure. At the upper end of the portage, Lewis assembled the iron frame and covered it with elk skins sewn together and sealed with a mixture of beeswax, buffalo tallow, and charcoal. The boat looked magnificent when completed. Lewis launched it with high hopes, but the sealing mixture did not adhere properly to the skins. Water seeped through the seams. The boat began to sink. After all his planning and effort, Lewis had to abandon his experimental craft. The men hastily constructed 2 more dugout canoes to replace the lost capacity. The expedition finally left the Great Falls behind on July 15th and continued up the Missouri. The river was becoming narrower and swifter, flowing through increasingly rugged country. The mountains were drawing closer. On July 25th, they reached a point where 3 streams joined to form the Missouri. The captains named these streams the Jefferson, Madison, and Gallatin Rivers after the President, Secretary of State, and Secretary of the Treasury. They followed the Jefferson River, which appeared to be the main branch southwestward toward the mountains. The river was becoming difficult to navigate. Beaver dams blocked the channel. The water was shallow and swift. The men often had to get out and drag the canoes through icy water. Sacagawea began to recognize landmarks. She had been captured near here as a child. The expedition was entering Shoshone country. Finding the Shoshone was now critical. The expedition needed horses to cross the mountains. They also needed guides who knew the mountain passes. Without Shoshone help, the expedition might not be able to continue. Lewis, always impatient, decided to scout ahead with a small party to find the Shoshones. On August 9th, 1805, Lewis and 3 men left the main party and hiked cross-country toward the west. They followed Indian trails, looking for any sign of Shoshone camps. On August 11th, Lewis spotted a mounted Indian in the distance. Lewis approached carefully, holding up a blanket and making signs for peace. But the Shoshone rider, uncertain of Lewis's intentions, wheeled his horse and galloped away. Lewis was disappointed, but pressed on. On August 12, 1805, Lewis and his companions crossed the Continental Divide at Lemhi Pass on the present-day border between Montana and Idaho. Lewis stood at the crest of the pass and looked westward, expecting to see the Columbia River Valley and perhaps even a glimpse of the Pacific Ocean. Instead, he saw an endless succession of mountain ranges, ridge after ridge, fading into the distance. The reality of the Rocky Mountains confronted Lewis's hopes. There would be no easy portage. The mountains were far more extensive than anyone had imagined. The next day, August 13th, Lewis encountered a group of Shoshone women digging roots. He approached slowly, showing the Jefferson Peace Medals and making signs of friendship. The women were frightened, but Lewis managed to calm them. Soon, Shoshone warriors appeared, led by a chief named Kamiawait. Lewis distributed gifts and tried to communicate through signs that he had come in peace and wished to trade for horses. Kamiawait and his people were initially wary. The Shoshones had recently been attacked by their enemies, the Hidatsas, and they were understandably suspicious of strangers. But Lewis's gifts, his peaceful manner, and his obvious vulnerability, only 4 men, far from any support, convinced the Shoshones of his good intentions. They agreed to come to the river and meet the rest of the expedition. On August 17th, the dramatic reunion occurred. As Sacagawea began translating for the captains, she suddenly recognized Kamiawait. He was her brother. She had been separated from her people for 4 or 5 years, captured as a child, sold to the Hidatsas, and eventually taken as a wife by Charbonneau. Now, against all odds, she had returned to her people, and the chief of her band was her own brother. Sacagawea wept as she embraced Kamiawait. The Shoshones wept with her, The emotional reunion broke down any remaining barriers. Cameawait agreed to provide horses and guides for the expedition. He warned the captains that the route ahead was extremely difficult, that game was scarce in the mountains, and that winter came early at high elevations, but he would help them as much as he could. The expedition spent more than a week with the Shoshones, trading for horses and preparing for the mountain crossing. They acquired 29 horses, not as many as they wanted, but enough to carry their supplies and baggage. They also hired an old Shoshone man as a guide. The captains called him Old Toby. Toby agreed to lead them over the mountains to the rivers that flowed toward the Pacific. On August 31st, 1805, the expedition left the Shoshone camp and headed into the Bitterroot Mountains. They had to travel north before they could turn west, following a route that Toby knew. The journey through the mountains would prove to be the most harrowing ordeal of the entire expedition. Part 5. Crossing the Bitterroots. The Bitterroot Mountains stretched before the expedition like a vast, hostile wilderness. These mountains were not the single ridge the captains had imagined. They were range after range of rugged peaks, steep valleys, and dense forests. The trails were narrow, rocky, and treacherous. Game was indeed scarce. Winter threatened. The expedition followed Old Toby north through the Bitterroot Valley, then turned west to cross the mountains. The route took them along precipitous trails that clung to mountainsides, where a misstep could send a horse tumbling hundreds of feet. The horses, heavily loaded and unused to such difficult terrain, frequently lost their footing. One horse fell and rolled down a mountainside, landing in a creek. Miraculously, the animal survived, though the supplies it carried were scattered and damaged. As the expedition climbed higher, the weather deteriorated. Snow began to fall in early September, unusual even for the mountains. The temperature dropped. The men had inadequate clothing for such conditions. Many suffered from cold and exhaustion. They were hungry too. Game had disappeared, and they were reduced to eating portable soup and horse meat. One horse was slaughtered for food. The meat was lean and tough, but it was better than starving. The trail wound through dense timber, over fallen logs, and across steep ridges. Visibility was poor. Snow continued to fall. Old Toby, the guide, became confused about the route. He had travelled this path before, but not in such conditions, and landmarks were obscured by snow. On September 16th, after several days of wandering, the expedition emerged from the timber onto a bald ridge. From here, they could see the trail more clearly. They were still on the right path, but they were exhausted, cold, and hungry. Clark, scouting ahead with a small party, pushed forward to find game or to reach lower elevations where hunting might be better. He killed a few grouse and a coyote, which his party ate. But substantial game remained elusive. The country was simply too high and too cold. The main party struggled on. Several men collapsed from exhaustion and had to be helped by their companions. The horses were in terrible condition, stumbling and falling repeatedly. More horses had to be slaughtered for food. Lewis wrote in his journal that the expedition was in dire circumstances, that the men were fatigued, cold, wet, and hungry, and that morale was low. On September 20th, Clark and his advance party finally descended to lower elevations and reached a prairie where a band of Nez Perce Indians lived. The Nez Perce, whose name meant pierced noses in French, though they did not actually pierce their noses, were a powerful tribe who controlled much of the Columbia Plateau. They had never seen white men before, but they received Clark's party with friendship and hospitality. The Nez Perce gave Clark and his men dried salmon and Camas root bread. After days of near starvation, the men ate voraciously, too voraciously. The sudden abundance of food, particularly the oily dried salmon, made them violently ill. Clark himself became sick and weak. The main party arrived a few days later, equally starved. They too gorged on salmon and roots, and they too became ill. For several days, most of the expedition was incapacitated with severe stomach cramps and diarrhea. Lewis and Clark dosed themselves and the men with Rush's pills and other medicines. Gradually, their digestive systems adjusted to the new diet, and they began to recover. The expedition rested with the Nez Perce for more than a week, regaining their strength and preparing for the next leg of the journey. The Nez Perce chief, Twisted Hair, provided information about the rivers ahead. The expedition could build canoes and float down the Clearwater River to the Snake River, and from there to the Great Columbia River that flowed to the Pacific. The men were too weak to hunt, and the Nez Perce horses would be needed for the return journey, so the expedition made an arrangement with the Nez Perce to care for their horses over the winter. They branded the horses with the expedition's mark and left them in the care of Twisted Hair's people. Starting in late September, the men began building canoes. They used the Nez Perce method of burning out the interior of logs, a faster technique than carving. By October 7th, 1805, 5 dugout canoes were completed. The expedition loaded their supplies, said goodbye to their Nez Perce hosts, and launched onto the Clearwater River. After the ordeal in the mountains, travelling by water was a relief. The current carried them swiftly downstream. They covered 40 to 50 miles per day with little effort. On October 10th, they reached the Snake River. The country here was arid, with sagebrush and scattered pine trees. Salmon were running, and Native American fishing camps lined the river. The expedition purchased fresh salmon, dogs, which they found quite palatable, and roots from the various bands they encountered. The Snake River had dangerous rapids, but the expedition had expert boatmen, and the captains were willing to risk running rapids rather than portaging around them. Several times the canoes shipped water and nearly swamped, but they always made it through. Once, a canoe struck a rock and split. The men managed to reach shore, and the canoe was repaired with pitch from pine trees. On October 16, 1805, the expedition reached the Columbia River. This was the great river that Robert Gray, an American sea captain, had discovered in 1792 and named after his ship. The Columbia was the highway to the Pacific. Lewis and Clark knew that British and American trading ships visited the Columbia's mouth regularly. If they could reach the ocean before winter, they would have achieved their primary objective, finding a route across the continent. The Columbia was even larger and more powerful than the Missouri. It flowed through a deep gorge with basalt cliffs rising on either side. Rapids and falls were numerous and dangerous. The most formidable was Celilo Falls, a major obstacle where the river dropped over a series of ledges and cascades. This site was also a major Native American trading center, where tribes from throughout the region gathered to fish for salmon and trade goods. The expedition portaged around Celilo Falls then continued downriver. They passed through the Columbia Gorge, a spectacular canyon where the river cut through the Cascade Mountains. Waterfalls tumbled from cliffs. The forests were dense with fir and cedar. The climate was wetter here on the western side of the mountains, and rain fell frequently. As the expedition descended the Columbia, they encountered more and more Native American peoples. The Chinookan tribes, who lived along the lower Columbia, had extensive trading contacts with European and American ships. Some wore European clothing. They had iron axes, copper kettles, and muskets obtained through trade. They were shrewd traders who drove hard bargains. The expedition found that the Chinookans were less impressed with their goods and gifts than the inland tribes had been. The Chinookans also practiced head flattening, a custom where infants' heads were bound to boards, resulting in a dramatically sloped forehead considered beautiful by their culture. The expedition found this practice strange, but recorded it carefully in their journals. On November 7th, 1805, William Clark wrote one of the most famous entries in his journal. "Ocean in view, oh, the joy." Actually, they were still some 20 miles from the ocean, in the wide estuary of the Columbia River, but Clark's excitement was understandable. After 18 months and approximately 4,000 miles of travel, the Pacific Ocean was finally near. The expedition proceeded down the estuary, but their joy was tempered by miserable conditions. It rained constantly. Waves from the ocean surged up the estuary, swamping their canoes. They camped on beaches where the tide came in at night, soaking them as they slept. Supplies were damp and beginning to rot. The men were wet, cold, and miserable. They could not find a suitable place to establish winter quarters on the north side of the Columbia. On November 24th, Clark conducted a remarkable vote to decide what to do. Every member of the expedition was allowed to vote, including York and Sacagawea. This was extraordinary for the time, a black slave and an Indian woman voting alongside white men. The vote indicated Clark's pragmatic leadership style and his recognition that everyone's opinion mattered when survival was at stake. The majority voted to cross to the south side of the Columbia and search for a better location. On December 7th, 1805, they found a suitable site near present-day Astoria, Oregon. The men immediately began constructing winter quarters, which they named Fort Clatsop after the local Clatsop tribe. Fort Clatsop was similar in design to Fort Mandan, a stockade with log cabins arranged around a central plaza. The construction went quickly, and by December 23rd, the fort was habitable. On Christmas Day, 1805, the expedition celebrated in their new quarters. The men fired their rifles in salute, exchanged small gifts, and enjoyed a special meal. But it was a subdued celebration. They were far from home in a cold, wet climate, surrounded by dense forest with months of winter ahead. Part 6. Winter at Fort Clatsop. The winter of 1805 to 1806 at Fort Clatsop was miserable. It rained almost constantly. From December to March, there were only 12 days without rain. The men's clothing rotted from the damp, leather moulded, metal rusted, everything was perpetually wet. The men huddled around smoky fires in their cramped cabins, trying to stay warm and dry. Game was scarce and difficult to hunt in the dense forests and constant rain. The expedition relied heavily on elk, which were relatively abundant. Hunting parties went out regularly, sometimes for days at a time, to kill elk and preserve the meat. They also traded with the Clatsop and other local tribes for roots, fish, and occasionally dogs. The expedition had hoped that a trading ship might visit the Columbia during the winter, allowing them to purchase fresh supplies and send letters back to the United States. But no ships came. The men were isolated, dependent on their own resources, and facing the prospect of the long return journey with dwindling supplies. The captains spent the winter working on their journals and maps. Lewis wrote detailed descriptions of the plants, animals, and peoples they had encountered. Clark worked on master maps that synthesized all their route information and geographical observations. These maps would prove to be remarkably accurate and would be used by explorers and settlers for decades. The men stayed busy with routine tasks: hunting, repairing equipment, making clothing from elk skins, and maintaining the fort. Discipline was enforced. Courts-martial were held for various infractions. The captains also provided medical care to the men and to local Indians who came seeking help. Lewis used his medical kit to treat a wide variety of ailments, from simple cuts to serious infections. His success rate was reasonably good, given the limitations of early 19th century medicine. One notable incident involved a whale. In early January, word reached Fort Clatsop that a large whale had beached some distance down the coast. Clark organized an expedition to view the whale and to obtain blubber and oil. Sacagawea insisted on going along. She had traveled thousands of miles and had seen the great ocean and many wonders, but she had not yet seen a whale, and she was determined to see this marvel. Clark agreed. The party hiked to the beach where the whale lay. By the time they arrived, local Indians had already stripped most of the meat and blubber. Only the enormous skeleton remained. Clark purchased a small quantity of blubber and oil from the Indians. The expedition returned to Fort Clatsop, and the whale blubber was distributed among the men. They found it palatable, though greasy. As winter progressed, the men grew increasingly eager to begin the return journey. They were homesick, tired of rain and cold, and anxious about whether they had sufficient supplies for the trip back. The captains decided to leave as early as possible in the spring, even if conditions were not ideal. On March 23, 1806, the expedition departed Fort Clatsop. They gave the fort to the Clatsop Indians, who seemed pleased to acquire the sturdy buildings. The expedition loaded their canoes and headed back up the Columbia River. The return journey would prove different from the outbound trip. The captains now knew the route, at least as far as the Rockies. They could travel faster and more confidently, but they also faced new challenges, particularly in crossing the Bitterroot Mountains again. Part 7. The Return Journey. The expedition made good progress up the Columbia River during late March and April. The salmon runs had not yet begun, so they could not rely on fish for food. They traded with the river tribes for dogs and roots, hunted when possible, and carefully rationed their remaining supplies. By late April, they were back among the Nez Perce, who had cared for their horses over the winter. The horses were in good condition, and the expedition prepared for the mountain crossing. But the captains faced a critical problem. It was too early. Snow still blocked the passes. Old Toby, their guide from the previous year, was not available. The Nez Perce warned them that attempting to cross before the snow melted would be dangerous, possibly fatal. Impatient to proceed, Lewis and Clark decided to try anyway. In mid-June, they started into the mountains. Within days, they realized their mistake. The snow was 8 to 10 feet deep in places. The trail was completely obscured. The horses floundered and fell. There was no game and no grazing for the horses. After advancing only a short distance, the captains admitted defeat and retreated. They returned to the Nez Perce camps and waited. 2 weeks later, in late June, they tried again, this time with Nez Perce guides who knew the route intimately. With expert guidance, the crossing was swift and relatively easy. They crossed the Bitterroots in just 6 days, a remarkable contrast to the agonizing 11-day ordeal of the previous fall. Once across the mountains, the captains made a significant decision. They would split the expedition into smaller parties to explore additional territory and gather more information. Lewis would take a group north to explore the Marias River, a northern tributary of the Missouri that they had passed on the outbound journey. Clark would take another group south to explore the Yellowstone River. The parties would reunite at the confluence of the Yellowstone and Missouri rivers. This decision was risky. Splitting up reduced each party's defensive capability and meant that if one party encountered disaster, the other might never know. But the captains were confident, and the potential rewards in terms of geographical knowledge were substantial. On July 3rd, 1806, the expedition split up. Lewis, with 9 men, including Drouillard, headed north. Clark, with the remaining party, including Sacagawea, Charbonneau, and York, headed east and south toward the Yellowstone. Lewis's exploration of the Marias River was aimed at determining how far north the river reached. This was important because the boundary between American and British territory had not been clearly defined, and the northern extent of the Louisiana Purchase was uncertain. If the Marias reached far north, it would support American claims to more territory. Lewis and his men followed the Marias River for several days. He determined that it did not reach as far north as he had hoped. On July 26th, as Lewis prepared to return to the Missouri, his party encountered 8 Piegan Blackfeet warriors. The Blackfeet were a powerful confederacy of tribes who controlled much of the northern plains. They had obtained guns through trade with the British and were fiercely protective of their territory. Relations between the Blackfeet and the expedition were tense from the start. Lewis tried to be friendly, but the Blackfeet were suspicious. That night, Lewis's party and the Blackfeet camped together. In the early morning hours of July 27th, some of the Blackfeet attempted to steal the expedition's guns and horses. A fight broke out. One of Lewis's men, Reuben Field, stabbed a Blackfeet warrior who was trying to steal his rifle. Joseph Field shot and killed another warrior who was attempting to steal horses. Lewis himself shot a third warrior who was running away with stolen guns. It was the only violent conflict between the expedition and Native Americans during the entire journey. 2 Blackfeet were dead, and Lewis's party was in extreme danger. The main Blackfeet camp was nearby, and if warriors came after them in force, Lewis's small party would be overwhelmed. Lewis ordered an immediate retreat. The men saddled their horses and rode hard for the Missouri River, covering over 100 miles in 24 hours, one of the longest recorded rides in American frontier history. They abandoned much of their equipment, including Lewis's personal notes and scientific specimens from the Marias River exploration. They reached the Missouri safely and met up with the rest of Lewis's detachment, who had been bringing canoes down the river. They immediately loaded the canoes and continued downstream, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and any pursuing Blackfeet. No pursuit materialized, but the encounter had been sobering. Lewis recognized that the Blackfeet, allied with British traders and hostile to American presence, would be a significant obstacle to American expansion in the northern Rockies. Meanwhile, Clark's party had traveled to the Yellowstone River without significant incident. Clark supervised the construction of dugout canoes, then floated down the Yellowstone to its confluence with the Missouri. Along the way, Sacagawea proved invaluable, pointing out landmarks and suggesting routes based on her knowledge of the country. One notable incident occurred when Clark discovered a massive rock outcropping along the Yellowstone River. He climbed to the top and carved his name and the date in the rock. This site, now known as Pompey's Tower, remains one of the few physical traces of the expedition visible today. Clark named the rock formation after Sacagawea's son, whom he had grown very fond of. The two parties reunited on August 12, 1806, at the confluence of the Yellowstone and Missouri rivers, near the present-day North Dakota-Montana border. There was one casualty to report. Pierre Cruzat, one of the men, had accidentally shot Lewis in the buttocks while elk hunting. Cruzat, whose eyesight was poor, had mistaken Lewis for an elk in thick brush. The wound was painful and embarrassing, but not life-threatening. Lewis, unable to sit comfortably, spent the next several days lying on his stomach in the canoe as the expedition floated downriver. The expedition continued downstream, making excellent time with the current in their favour. They passed the Mandan villages in mid-August and said goodbye to Sacagawea, Charbonneau, and Jean-Baptiste, who remained among the Hidatsas. Clark had become attached to young Jean-Baptiste, or Pomp, and he offered to raise and educate the boy in Saint Louis. Charbonneau and Sacagawea agreed, but decided that Jean-Baptiste was still too young. They would bring him to Clark in a year or two. The expedition raced downriver, covering up to 70 miles per day. They saw the Great Falls, the White Cliffs, and all the familiar landmarks they had struggled past on the upstream journey. Everything looked different going downstream, easier, faster, and bathed in the golden light of late summer. On September 23rd, 1806, the expedition reached St. Charles. They were back in settled country. People lined the riverbank, waving and shouting greetings. The men fired their rifles in salute. That afternoon, they reached St. Louis. The expedition had been gone for more than 2 years. Many people had given them up for dead. Now they returned, weathered and lean, but alive and successful. Word spread quickly through St. Louis. Lewis and Clark had returned. They had reached the Pacific. They had completed an epic journey across the continent. Part 8. Aftermath and Legacy. The Lewis and Clark expedition arrived in St. Louis on September 23, 1806, having travelled approximately 8,000 miles over 2 years, 4 months and 10 days. Their return was greeted with celebration and astonishment. Many had believed they would never be seen again, swallowed by the vast wilderness or killed by hostile Indians. Instead, they had succeeded beyond all expectations. Lewis and Clark were instant celebrities. They travelled to Washington, where President Jefferson received them with joy and pride. Jefferson had feared for their safety and was thrilled by their success. He arranged for both captains to be richly rewarded. Lewis received 1,600 acres of land and was appointed governor of Louisiana Territory. Clark received 1,000 acres and was appointed superintendent of Indian affairs for Louisiana Territory and brigadier general of the territorial militia. The men of the expedition also received rewards. Each enlisted man was granted 320 acres of land and double pay for the duration of the expedition. Sergeants received 480 acres. These grants were significant, representing potential wealth if the land could be sold or successfully farmed. But beyond the immediate rewards, what had the expedition actually accomplished? What had they discovered, and what impact did their journey have? First, the expedition had gathered an enormous amount of scientific information. Lewis and Clark collected samples of 178 plants previously unknown to science, along with 122 species of animals. Their detailed descriptions and preserved specimens greatly expanded scientific knowledge of North American flora and fauna. Species first described by the expedition include the grizzly bear, prairie dog, pronghorn antelope, black-billed magpie, western meadowlark, and dozens of plant species. Lewis was an excellent observer, and his detailed descriptions of animal behavior, plant habitats, and ecological relationships were far ahead of their time. Second, the expedition produced detailed maps that revolutionized geographical knowledge of the American West. Clark's maps, based on daily observations, compass readings, and celestial navigation, were remarkably accurate. They showed the course of the Missouri River and its tributaries, the Rocky Mountains, the Columbia River system, and the general geography of the Louisiana Purchase. These maps filled in vast blank spaces that had existed on earlier maps and would guide explorers, trappers, and settlers for decades. Third, the expedition established American claims to the Pacific Northwest. By reaching the Pacific Ocean and establishing Fort Clatsop, the expedition strengthened American arguments that the Oregon Country should belong to the United States rather than to Britain. This would be important in later negotiations over the boundary between the United States and Canada. Fourth, the expedition opened the way for the fur trade. The reports of abundant beaver and other fur-bearing animals in the Rocky Mountains sparked a rush of trappers and traders into the region. Men like John Colter, who had been a member of the expedition, returned to the mountains and became mountain men, harvesting furs that supplied the lucrative international fur trade. This economic activity would have both positive and negative consequences, enriching traders while devastating some animal populations and disrupting Native American societies. Fifth, the expedition provided detailed information about Native American tribes. Lewis and Clark's journals contained descriptions of the languages, customs, material culture, and political organizations of dozens of tribes. They recorded vocabulary lists, drew pictures of clothing and tools, and tried to estimate populations and assess military strength. This ethnographic information was invaluable to later scholars, preserving knowledge of cultures that would be transformed or destroyed in subsequent decades. However, the expedition also had darker consequences. The expedition represented the beginning of the end for the traditional Native American way of life in the West. Within decades of Lewis and Clark's journey, American settlers would pour into the Louisiana Purchase. The buffalo would be hunted to near extinction. Tribes would be forced onto reservations. Diseases like smallpox would devastate populations. The peaceful trading relationship that Lewis and Clark had envisioned never materialized on the terms they had imagined. The expedition had also failed to find what Jefferson most hoped for, an all-water route across the continent. The Northwest Passage did not exist, at least not in any practical sense. The Rocky Mountains were far more extensive than anyone had imagined, and the portage required to cross them made any transcontinental water route impractical for commerce. Overland routes and eventually railroads would be needed to connect the east and west coasts. The personal fates of the expedition members varied widely. Meriwether Lewis's life after the expedition was troubled. As governor of Louisiana Territory, he struggled with administrative duties and political conflicts. He had difficulty completing the official account of the expedition that Jefferson expected. He suffered from bouts of depression, possibly melancholia as it was then called. On October 11, 1809, while travelling to Washington, Lewis died of gunshot wounds at a remote inn on the Natchez Trace in Tennessee. The official verdict was suicide, though some historians have suggested murder. Lewis was only 35 years old. William Clark lived a much longer and more successful life. As Superintendent of Indian Affairs, he worked for decades managing relations between the United States government and Native American tribes. He genuinely respected Native Americans and tried to deal fairly with them, though he operated within a system that was fundamentally unjust. Clark never forgot his promise to educate Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau. When the boy was about 6 years old, Charbonneau and Sacagawea brought him to St. Louis, and Clark became his guardian and patron. Clark paid for Jean-Baptiste's education, and the young man grew up bilingual and bicultural, eventually travelling to Europe and leading a remarkable life as a frontiersman and guide. Clark also remained close to York. After the expedition, York expected his freedom, having served faithfully and proven himself the equal of any man on the journey. But Clark was a product of his time and culture, and he did not free York immediately. The two men had a painful falling out. Eventually, Clark did grant York his freedom, probably in the 1820s, and York went into the freight hauling business. According to some accounts, York died of cholera in Tennessee. According to others, he lived among Native American tribes in the West. The truth is uncertain, lost to history like so much else. Sacagawea's later life is also somewhat mysterious. She appears in historical records at Fort Manuel, a trading post in present-day South Dakota, in December of 1812. A clerk named John Lutig recorded that the wife of Charbonneau, a snake squaw, died of putrid fever on December 20th, 1812. Most historians believe this refers to Sacagawea, who would have been about 25 years old. However, some oral traditions among the Shoshone claim that Sacagawea lived until 1884 and died on the Wind River Reservation in Wyoming. The documentary evidence favors the earlier death date, but certainty is impossible. Regardless of when she died, Sacagawea's contributions to the expedition were invaluable. She served as interpreter, guide, and diplomat. Her presence reassured tribes that the expedition was peaceful. She identified edible plants, prepared food, and cared for her infant son throughout the arduous journey. She endured the same hardships as the men and never complained. Clark later wrote that Sacagawea had been of great service to the expedition, and modern historians agree that her role was crucial. Many of the expedition members returned to the frontier. Some became prominent in the fur trade, others settled down to farm their land grants. John Coulter, after leaving the expedition on the return journey, spent several years in the Rockies and became the first European American to see the area that would become Yellowstone National Park. His descriptions of geysers and hot springs were so fantastic that people called them Coulter's Hell and assumed he was exaggerating or lying. George Droulard, the excellent hunter and interpreter, was killed by Blackfeet in 1810 while trapping beaver in Montana. John Potts, another expedition member, was killed in the same encounter. The Blackfeet, hostile to American trappers encroaching on their territory, posed a constant danger in the northern Rockies. Patrick Gass, the expedition's carpenter and a sergeant, lived to the remarkable age of 98, dying in 1870. He was the last surviving member of the expedition. He published his journal of the expedition in 1807, the first published account, appearing several years before the official expedition history. The official account of the expedition, titled History of the Expedition under the command of Captains Lewis and Clark, was not published until 1814, 8 years after the expedition's return and 5 years after Lewis's death. Nicholas Biddle, a Philadelphia lawyer and editor, compiled the work from Lewis and Clark's journals. The 2-volume set was a modest success and helped cement the expedition's place in American consciousness. The Lewis and Clark expedition became a defining event in American history. It represented American ambition, courage, and curiosity. The expedition's success seemed to validate manifest destiny, the idea that America was destined to expand across the continent. Later generations would romanticize the journey, seeing in Lewis and Clark's story a heroic quest and a symbol of American pioneer spirit. The expedition also represented a particular moment in American history, a brief window when peaceful coexistence between European Americans and Native Americans seemed possible. Lewis and Clark had traveled thousands of miles through Native American territory, largely dependent on Indian hospitality and assistance. With few exceptions, they were received peacefully. They traded fairly, shared meals, smoked peace pipes, and exchanged gifts. For a moment, a different future seemed imaginable. But that moment passed. Within decades, the relationship between the United States and Native American tribes had become defined by violence, broken treaties, forced removals, and cultural destruction. The westward expansion that Lewis and Clark helped initiate would bring prosperity to millions of American settlers, but catastrophe to the indigenous peoples who had lived in the West for thousands of years. Modern assessments of the Lewis and Clark expedition have become more nuanced. While recognizing the expedition's genuine achievements in exploration, science, and human endurance, historians also acknowledge its role in opening the West to American expansion and the suffering that expansion caused. The expedition cannot be separated from the larger history of American colonialism and indigenous dispossession. The journals kept by Lewis and Clark and several of their men remain extraordinary documents. They provide detailed observations of a landscape and peoples at a particular moment in history. They record daily life on the expedition, what the men ate, how they travelled, what they saw, what they thought and felt. Reading these journals, one can almost experience the journey, the back-breaking labour of hauling boats upstream, the terror of confronting a grizzly bear, the awe of seeing the Pacific Ocean for the first time, the gnawing hunger in the Bitterroot Mountains, the boredom of rainy days at Fort Clatsop. The expedition route has become a pilgrimage site for Americans interested in history and adventure. Modern travelers can follow the Lewis and Clark Trail from St. Louis to the Pacific, visiting interpretive centers, monuments, and museums along the way. The Missouri River, though much changed by dams and channelization, still flows past many of the sites the expedition visited. The Columbia River Gorge remains spectacular. The Great Falls of the Missouri, though now divided among several hydroelectric dams, can still be experienced. Fort Clatsop has been reconstructed and is now part of Lewis and Clark National Historical Park. The bicentennial of the expedition, from 2004 to 2006, sparked renewed interest. Museums mounted special exhibitions. Authors published new books analyzing various aspects of the journey. Native American tribes held ceremonies and offered their perspectives on the expedition's meaning. Scholars debated the expedition's legacy, its achievements, and its costs. What, then, should we make of the Lewis and Clark expedition? Perhaps it is best understood as a human story, a tale of people facing challenges with courage, ingenuity, and determination. Lewis and Clark were flawed men, products of their time, with limited perspectives and problematic assumptions. But they also possessed genuine curiosity, respect for the natural world, and concern for the welfare of their men. The expedition members, soldiers, boatmen, and interpreters, York and Sacagawea, all showed remarkable resilience in the face of hardship. The expedition reminds us that exploration is difficult, dangerous, and often disappointing. The Northwest Passage did not exist. The Rocky Mountains were far more formidable than expected. Winter was cold, food was scarce, and everything took longer than planned. Yet the expedition persevered. When they faced obstacles, they found ways around them. When their plans failed, they adapted. When disaster struck, they recovered and continued. In that sense, the Lewis and Clark expedition transcends its specific historical context and becomes a universal story about human capability and endurance. It asks, what are we willing to endure to satisfy our curiosity about what lies beyond the horizon? What sacrifices are we willing to make in pursuit of knowledge? How do we balance the costs and benefits of exploration and expansion? These questions remain relevant today. We still explore, though now our frontiers are space, the deep ocean, and the microscopic world. We still grapple with the tension between knowledge and exploitation, between discovery and impact. We still must decide how to remember and honor the past while acknowledging its complexities and contradictions. The Lewis and Clark expedition was an extraordinary journey that expanded America's geographical knowledge, strengthened its territorial claims, and opened the West to future settlement. It was also a journey that had profound and often negative consequences for the indigenous peoples who had called the West home for millennia. Both things are true, and both deserve to be remembered. As we drift towards sleep, let us remember the expedition as it was, a group of people, remarkable in some ways and ordinary in others, who set out into unknown country and returned to tell their story. They faced rivers and mountains, heat and cold, hunger and exhaustion. They encountered peoples and places they had never imagined. They collected plants and animals, drew maps, and kept journals, and they made it home. Part 9. Reflections on Discovery. As we near the end of our journey through this remarkable chapter of American history, it is worth contemplating what discovery truly means. Lewis and Clark are often credited with discovering the American West, but of course, millions of people already lived there. The lands they crossed were not wilderness, but homelands, inhabited by complex societies with their own histories, cultures, and knowledge systems. The Mandan and Hidatsa peoples who hosted the expedition at Fort Mandan had been living in earth lodge villages along the Missouri River for centuries. They had sophisticated agricultural practices, extensive trading networks, and detailed knowledge of the surrounding territory. The Nez Perce, who saved the expedition from starvation in the Bitterroot Mountains, knew every mountain pass, every river, every meadow where camas roots grew. The Clatsop people at the mouth of the Columbia had been fishing for salmon and hunting elk in their territory for thousands of years. What Lewis and Clark discovered was not new lands or new peoples, but rather new information for European Americans. They created a bridge between different knowledge systems, translating indigenous geographical knowledge into maps and journals that Americans in the East could understand. They collected scientific specimens that expanded Western understanding of North American biodiversity. They established diplomatic and commercial connections between the United States government and Native American nations. In this sense, the expedition was an act of translation as much as discovery. Lewis and Clark were translators, converting indigenous place names into English, drawing Western-style maps of territories that Native Americans had long understood through their own cartographic traditions, and describing plants and animals that indigenous peoples had known intimately for generations. The expedition also revealed the limits of Western knowledge. Despite their scientific training, Lewis and Clark often relied on Native American expertise. When they needed to find the Shoshone to obtain horses, Sacagawea's presence was crucial. When they needed to cross the Bitterroot Mountains, they required Nez Perce guides. When they needed food, they depended on indigenous hunting and gathering knowledge. The expedition's success was not solely the result of American ingenuity and determination, but was fundamentally dependent on Native American assistance. This dependence on indigenous knowledge was common in the age of exploration. European explorers around the world relied on local guides, interpreters, and informants. The discoveries credited to European explorers were often really rediscoveries, or rather, the integration of local knowledge into European geographical and scientific frameworks. The Lewis and Clark expedition also illustrates the complex relationships between exploration, commerce, and empire. Jefferson framed the expedition as a scientific and commercial venture, but it was also fundamentally about extending American sovereignty and influence. The act of mapping territory, naming geographical features, conducting censuses of Native American populations, and distributing American flags and medals were all acts of imperial assertion, claiming territory and peoples for the United States. These claims were backed by no real force in 1804. The expedition was a small, vulnerable party traveling through territory controlled by powerful Native American nations. But the expedition laid the groundwork for later American expansion. The maps they created would guide traders, trappers, and eventually settlers. The diplomatic relationships they established would be invoked in later treaty negotiations. The precedent of American presence in the Pacific Northwest would support American territorial claims. Within a few decades, American power in the West would be overwhelming. The U.S. Army would establish forts throughout the region. American settlers would arrive in the hundreds of thousands. Treaties would be signed and broken. Native American tribes would be confined to reservations, often far from their traditional homelands. The buffalo would be hunted to near extinction, deliberately destroyed to undermine Plains Indian societies. Diseases introduced by Europeans would devastate native populations. This was not the future Lewis and Clark imagined. They envisioned a West where American traders and Native Americans would engage in mutually beneficial commerce, where different peoples would live side by side in peace. They did not foresee the scale and speed of American expansion or the violence and tragedy that would accompany it. Yet they helped set this future in motion by making the West knowable to Americans in the East, by showing that the journey could be made, by mapping routes and resources. The expedition made westward expansion seem possible and desirable. In this way, Lewis and Clark were simultaneously explorers and agents of empire, scientists and colonizers, adventurers and harbingers of conquest. Understanding this complexity does not diminish the expedition's genuine achievements. The physical and mental demands of the journey were extraordinary. The men endured heat and cold, hunger and illness, exhaustion and fear. They faced dangerous animals, treacherous rivers, and towering mountains. They persevered through monotonous labor and moments of genuine terror. The fact that they succeeded, that they reached the Pacific and returned home with only one death from natural causes, is genuinely remarkable. The scientific contributions were also real and valuable. The plants and animals they collected, the observations they made, the journals they kept, all expanded human knowledge. Future botanists, zoologists, and geologists would build on their work. The maps they created were used for decades. The ethnographic information they gathered preserved knowledge of cultures that would soon be transformed beyond recognition. But we can acknowledge these achievements while also recognizing that the expedition was part of a larger story of colonization and indigenous dispossession. We can admire Lewis and Clark's courage and persistence while also understanding that their journey had consequences they neither foresaw nor intended. We can appreciate the expedition as a remarkable human achievement while also grieving for what was lost as a result of American westward expansion. History is complicated. People are complicated. The Lewis and Clark expedition, like most historical events, cannot be reduced to a simple narrative of heroes and villains, triumph and tragedy. It is all of these things simultaneously, a scientific achievement and an imperial venture, an epic journey and the beginning of catastrophe, a story of cooperation between peoples and a prelude to conflict and conquest. As you drift further towards sleep, consider these various threads, these multiple meanings. The past is not a single story, but many stories, interwoven and sometimes contradictory. The expedition was real, the rivers and mountains were real, the hunger and cold were real, the meetings with Native Americans were real. So too were the consequences, both intended and unintended, both immediate and long-term. Perhaps this is the most important lesson from the Lewis and Clark expedition, that our actions have consequences we cannot fully anticipate, that journeys of discovery are also journeys of change, and that understanding history requires holding multiple perspectives simultaneously, honoring achievement while acknowledging cost, celebrating courage while recognizing complexity. The Lewis and Clark expedition remains one of the defining journeys in American history. From 1804 to 1806, a small group of explorers traveled 8,000 miles across a continent, from the forests of Missouri to the Pacific Ocean and back again. They mapped rivers and mountains, collected plants and animals, met dozens of Native American tribes, and survived challenges that would have defeated lesser men. Meriwether Lewis and William Clark led with complementary skills and unshakable partnership. Their men, soldiers, and frontiersmen, hunters, and boatmen showed remarkable resilience. Sacagawea provided crucial interpretation and diplomacy. York's strength and hunting skills contributed to the expedition's success. Countless Native Americans offered hospitality, information, and assistance without which the expedition would have failed. The expedition expanded scientific knowledge, strengthened American territorial claims, opened the West to the fur trade, and paved the way for westward expansion. It also marked the beginning of the end for traditional Native American life in the West, initiating changes that would bring prosperity to some and catastrophe to others. Today, more than 200 years later, we can look back on the Lewis and Clark expedition with appreciation for its achievements and awareness of its complexities. We can honour the courage and determination of the expedition members while also acknowledging the perspectives and experiences of the indigenous peoples whose lands they crossed and whose lives were forever changed by American expansion. The rivers still flow, though many are now dammed. The mountains still stand, though roads now cross the passes. The Great Plains still stretch to the horizon, though the buffalo herds are gone and farms and cities cover the grasslands. The Pacific waves still break on the shore near where Fort Clatsop once stood. And the journals remain, detailed records of an extraordinary journey, preserving the voices of men and a woman who faced the unknown with courage and curiosity. Their words carry us across time, allowing us to walk beside them, to see what they saw, to feel something of what they felt. As you finally surrender to sleep, let the rhythm of the Missouri River carry you, the endless current pushing against the boats, the men straining at the oars, the shore sliding slowly past. Let the vast silence of the prairie surround you, broken only by wind in the grass and the distant thunder of buffalo herds. Feel the cold of the Bitterroot snow, the relief of descending to lower elevations, the joy of reaching the Pacific. The Lewis and Clark expedition is history, but it is also a story, a human story about journey and endurance, discovery and consequence, hope and complexity. It is a story worth remembering, worth revisiting, worth understanding in all its dimensions. And now, as the story ends, as the expedition returns to St. Louis, as Lewis and Clark shake hands with President Jefferson, as the men receive their land grants and medals, as Sacagawea returns to her people, as York hopes for freedom, as the great adventure becomes memory and then history, let yourself drift, let the details fade, let the expedition recede into the comfortable distance of the past. Sleep well, knowing that the rivers still flow, the mountains still stand, and the story remains, preserved in journals and journals and journals, waiting to be read again, waiting to carry new readers on that great journey from the Mississippi to the Pacific and back again. Thank you for listening to Sleepless History. Rest well and good night.